And good morning. We've got an excellent connection, it says. And it just did something at the top of the screen. I'm not sure what that was. It looks like we're good to go. I still haven't figured the audio out yet. I just spent the last 20 minutes trying to get it figured out, and it's going to take me some time, which I don't know that I'll have today, but we'll see what happens. Drop this down a little bit. Let's see. Put that up there. There we go. Okay. Now I can see my time and all that good stuff. It is Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. Well, in Port Orchard, Washington, it's 10 o'clock. It's different for different people. But I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. If this is your first time hopping on, I'm basically just pulling names out of a hat that I have right here. And I've asked family and friends to give me some topics to talk about that they would want to hear me talk about. Put their names in a hat, just pull the name out, go to the list of topics, and talk about one of the topics. And for me, it's kind of this way of doing kind of video journal of my thoughts and perspectives at 33 during the year of the Great Pause. And so much is seemingly changing a lot quicker than it has been. We're just feeling it. So thought this would be a good time. I have the time and space to kind of create the momentum and then hope it carries into my job. And it's kind of a little fun creative outlet for me and a way to stay connected and engaged to the people that I love. And maybe eventually people I don't know. But for right now, it's just been a fun way to stay connected and engaged with people that I do. So, I think that's all I had this morning. This is at 10 instead of 9 when I normally do it because I woke up with a little bit of a sinus thing, so I decided to let my body rest a little more. And so I woke up and listened to a talk by Ajahn Sona, who, if you're interested in Buddhism at all, is kind of a fun person to listen to. His teaching style is really unique in that, at least in the forest tradition of Buddhism, there's kind of this really specific way of teaching, and it can be a little bit hard to adjust to in the beginning. I love it, but Ajahn Siddhanta and Ajahn Sona are both two monks that I've found that process things from kind of a little bit more of an accessible teaching style to the broad public, which I have a deep appreciation for accessibility. So I love what they're doing and bringing their personalities to it, which is really interesting. Interesting thing to think about and maybe talk to him about at some point. Anyways, Ajahn Sona lives up in Canada. Lives at a monastery up in Canada, so it was fun listening to him this morning. We'll go and get started with the hat and the names. Pick out a topic and get going. David Zahina. I just put David Z. So I'll have to shoot this one to him. David is a wonderful, wonderful man. Sorry, I was reading a text from my grandma. Love her. All right, David. Let's look at yours. David gave me, again, a lot of good ones. I think I remember the one that I put at the top for him. Good morning, Shay. Shay just texted me and said, I can't comment because I don't have an account, but he's watching. I love and miss you. And Larissa and I need to come down and hang with the fam. We need to try to do that before we get back to flying. Shay has an amazing husband and 2 beautiful cats that I need to meet. Yep, I did. So David gave me a number of topics that I think he was genuinely interested in, and he also knew I would have fun talking about. And the first one I put at the top is mental hygiene. The second one I kind of already talked about in a previous one, with the correlations between schizophrenia and demon possession and medical diagnostic. Is it purely chemical? Patients insisting it's demons, those types of things. That was the second topic that I had that I kind of addressed in an indirect way. So depending on how far I get into mental hygiene and how much time I may touch on the topic of schizophrenia again, which keeps coming up. It came up for Larissa and I yesterday a couple times, which is interesting. So mental hygiene. Well, I mean, so something really interesting happened to me right around the time when I first met David, where I had entered into a season of my life where I was letting go of becoming, which was a huge value for me for, really started early on in my childhood, but really started blossoming in my 20s. This whole idea of becoming a amazing brother and man and leader and Christian and political person and world citizen, all these different ways of becoming these certain things. Becoming an intellect, becoming a thoughtful person, becoming a loving person, becoming a generous person. There was all these deeply seated intentions of this process of becoming, and there was I don't think there was anything theoretically wrong with it. I just entered into a stage where I realized that there was more than just chasing the process of becoming. And what ended up, so I entered into that suspended space of like kind of disenchantment with those journeys of becoming. And what ended up kind of bubbling up was this this desire to develop practices to to really pay attention to how I was, health, wellness, um, just the different aspects of what it meant to be a human. And it went from becoming to being, and the focus was on how I was being, how I was showing up, the quality of that, and wanting to really focus on continually cultivating a quality of being instead of becoming these different identities. I wasn't able to even articulate at the time that's what I was becoming disenchanted with, but it was really I was just kind of noticing that the process of becoming was like blossoming into these identities that, although weren't terrible and some of them were really great, they were still at best masks, that served certain purposes, and they weren't my kind of truer, deeper reality of who I was. And so I really, kind of what came out of that was this desire to just focus on being, how I was being, the quality of showing up as this person and as a human. And I met David right around that time, and we would go out and we'd go, play pool and have some beers, and sometimes, and then we'd go back and hang out and play games and stay up super late in the morning and wake up and drink coffee. And kind of, when I first met him, it was kind of 3 days of him and some friends of mine doing that, and there was this language that was thrown around that was something like, getting tuned up. So like in the morning when we'd have our coffee, we were getting tuned up. When we were going out having a couple beers, we were getting tuned up. And it was this playful way of kind of looking at the process of partying from a different lens of like tuning up for whatever the circumstance was that we were entering into. But I really latched onto this phrase and this ideology. And it's been a really important shift from becoming to being tuned up. And not necessarily tuned up in the partying sense, but in the process of asking myself, what kind of things can I practice and do that allow me to tune myself into the things that I want to be tuned into. And then like you would go get your car tuned up, tuning my body, mind, and heart in a way that's allowing me to run effectively in the ways that I want to. And so that's been a much more authentic paradigm for me to move into and play with and journey into than trying to become X, or just like what are the practices that I can put in my life that are going to help me cultivate X, help me cultivate love, help me cultivate joy, help me cultivate peace and hope and equanimity and gentleness and tenderness and patience. And, what kind of things can I do to tune myself into these internal spaces so that I can, constantly be emanating them throughout my life. So these are kind of the questions. So David's topic was mental hygiene. And, it's really interesting that we're in 2020. Humans have been existing on the earth for a little while now, and we have gotten to this place of caring about hygiene in certain parts of humanity, but I would say at large, as a species, we do care about hygiene in general, especially in more developed places, but we don't really think about or talk about mental hygiene. It's just not something that's on our radar yet. And it's moving, I think it's moving in that direction with some of the cultural shifts we've had in the psychological world and in the therapy world. And, the mindfulness movement, I think, is a huge evidence of an evolution of our, or maybe some people don't like that word, a maturation of the human species. However you want to understand that and interpret it historically, like the fact is, like, you can even look around and see that over the course of history, like we're growing up. It takes us a long time, but it's happening. But one of the things I think's going to continually grow and influence, at least while I'm alive, is this value for mental hygiene. And I think it's a beautiful thing. It's really important. And so I think that's probably all I want to talk about and share about mental hygiene from a idea perspective. I think I'd rather spend a little bit of time talking about some things that I do that help me stay tuned up and mentally astute and clear and clean and healthy. And there's a number of things that I do. So I'm trying to figure out what direction I want to go, because I don't want to share. I just want to share a few. And I've kind of already shared a few on a couple of these podcasts. So I have a buddy who was going through a really dark period of his life. A lot of people started dying. Family members. I think in the course of a couple weeks, he had 5 or 6 at least, and then it just kept happening. So it's just a lot of loss, and that's hard for any human to handle and deal with. And he's moved through it really well. But I kind of challenged him. I was like, you should get out on your. I knew he liked to longboard. He lives here in Seattle. I was like, you should get out on your longboard every morning and just go. Like, throw some headphones in and just go, and let me know if it helps. I was just kind of in these stages where we're developing practices. I think it's important to be reflective of the practices and if they're actually helping us cultivate what we're wanting to cultivate. So I was like, man, try this. And it seemed to be pretty effective for him. I don't know if he stayed with it. If he's watching, he'll know I'm talking about him. But there's something about some form of exercise, even if it's walking, whatever it is that we enjoy, that we can sustain and do outside and around some form of nature or some space that is somewhat generative for us to be in, that I think is really therapeutic and helps us not cohesively, but in a lot of different ways, a lot of different parts of our being kind of tune in to really beautiful mental states. And I think a lot of people do this, just they love yoga, so they'll go into a park and do yoga in a park. And there's just something different about being in nature if you have access to nature, especially if you live in a city. I mean, I remember I was going on a walk with a buddy of mine. We were on like a nature walk and just processing through living in New York and how to stay centered, stay grounded in a city like that. It's the way I talk about it is it's just like it's like the one city I've been to that feels like it's constantly on cocaine. Like the whole city, obviously not the whole city is, but like it just feels that way. It's just very frenetic. It feels like when I grew up taking ADD meds, like the Ritalin and Adderall, it was just that. It's just like everything's just like in kind of a, it's just sped up, highly sped up, and there's this really intoxicating feel to it, but it's not something that the energy of the city isn't something that lends itself to this calm, grounded, settled, whole, present experience of humanity. And so having nature, there's just something about it. I think for me, part of it is like there's this element of nature that's kind of irreverent to humanity. It's not tooting our horns. So it helps us kind of get out of our self-centered, self-centric spaces when you realize that this element of creation has been around for a really long time, longer than us, and it's doing okay. It's doing just fine, and it's kind of, it doesn't really need us, but you know, there is a kind of symbiotic relationship we have with it, and it also kind of pulls us in. If we can notice it really like invites us into this really beautiful experience if we will let nature do it. That's very cleansing. It's very inspiring, and deeply calming, and can be the opposite. That's one of the other crazy things about nature, is like it can have those effects on us, but then especially if we're in like a wilderness setting where there's not a lot of human travel, there's just elements that don't really pay the same attention to, at least in a caring way, to humanity that we do, where, you know, mosquitoes are gonna bug you regardless of how you feel about them or don't feel about them, and if you got food, bears are gonna go after you. So there's all these elements that I think are really healthy for humanity to experience and be with. So yeah, that would be one of the biggest ways for me, is just going on walks or runs out in some form of nature is a really quick way for me. I shared about the cold therapy, so I won't go into that. I've talked about some of my meditation practice, so I won't go back into that. If you have even one friend who, the language I like to use is hold space, but a lot of people don't really know what I mean by that when I talk about holding space. But someone who can listen to you really well, who when you sit with them, you don't feel like their attention is in two different places. And we can kind of feel and pick up on that when you feel like they're really attentive to what you're saying, how you're saying it, how you're feeling, and they're kind of leaning in to what you're saying. And also, like, you've developed enough of a relationship with them to realize that they're not going to be super reactive when you share certain things. If you can really feel this freedom to kind of open up elements of who you are that may not be safe in certain relationships, and you've kind of developed, even if you have one friend like that. And if you don't, like, there's pretty affordable therapists out there, especially now doing Zoom calls, but that's kind of a good therapist. That's what they're there for, just to be that space, hopefully that healthy mirroring space for you to dive in to these internal spaces and experience that. But for me, I I have a value for therapeutic relationships, but for me, a lot of that's just in these friendships I have that are just brilliant listeners and really good at leaving their agendas and perspectives at the door and just showing up and listening. That, I would say, developing rhythms of connecting and being present for those people and allowing those people to be present for you is a pretty amazing way to stay tuned up and stay mentally, really care for that mental hygiene, especially if you have family members that can do that. I would highly recommend doing that. And of course, practicing that for other people. It's good. It's a really good thing to practice. A lot of my meditation practice is kind of doing that for myself whenever I am able to unburden my mind, like I was talking about, and calm myself down and get into this really equanimous, peaceful, embodied place. I'm just kind of listening. I'm listening to myself and understanding what's happening in there and holding that space for myself as things arise and then cease. And that for sure helps me do it for other people. So, yeah, I think I've already talked about certain elements of my mental hygiene already. So those ways of just being active. If you have friendships in your life that have been on a real path of self-discovery and an inner cultivation of some kind of goodness, if you have friends like that are on that, or just try to spend time around them regularly. I mean, for me, that's a huge part. I don't think that I would have much of what I have outside of having those people in my life that have helped me move in these directions. There's just something really powerful about the people that we surround ourselves with and stay connected with. And for me right now, that's this community of forest monks, and then the householders and lay people that are connected to those communities, and really the Vipassana communities, the communities that practice this form of meditation at large. All of those people are a deep support for me. The teachings of the Buddha are a deep support for me right now, and really just any kind of previous person that has experienced a deep level of wisdom and has cultivated these really beautiful qualities. Like someone like Ram Dass. Ram Dass has been a huge support for me in cultivating this mental hygiene, and Ajahn Chah, who's the father of the Buddhist lineage, has been a huge support for me. And then the spiritual directors at Portland Friends of the Dhamma, the Lay Center, have been such a massive support for me in this cultivation of mental hygiene. It's just, I don't want to talk about this just from a brute effort perspective without communicating that finding refuge in those three areas have been such a tremendous support for me. And the Buddhist term for it is the triple gem: the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. So the support in the way I interact with it is enlightened beings the teachings of the way things are, just the nature of reality, and then spiritual community and support. Finding refuge in those three areas for me has been just as supportive, if not in some ways more supportive than even my own practices, because they help me sustain those practices and deepen them and provide a lot of the path for me in that way. And it's brought me so much genuine gratitude that at times when I'm recollecting on it, I will get really emotional, just for how thankful I am to have the community and the path that I have, and how much goodness it's brought me, and healing and health and wellness, especially mentally. So I wanted to touch on that. And then I'll go ahead and transition into the topic of specifically the kind of nuance of the demonic and then schizophrenic and then the psychological world. I kind of touched on mostly the psychological world and then schizophrenia and the interplay between that and the process of those creating spaces, hopefully eventually, for those people to exist in really beautiful ways in the world where they don't have all these really oppressive perspectives laid on them, but people are able to help them integrate. So I kind of talked about it from that perspective, but there is a really interesting element between the way that certain spiritual ideologies communicate and experience the demonic, and then what actually exists as schizophrenia in a psychological world and terminology. And I was having a long conversation with my dad about this, because I grew up experiencing a lot of very supernatural spiritual things that I would still say medically we have a very limited palette of understanding the nuance of a lot of the things I grew up experiencing very regularly. And one of those things was people being demonically possessed, people being delivered of demons, and actually encountering demons myself. Those experiences, no matter how you want to try to understand them from a rational perspective, are very real. I mean, I don't wonder if any of that was real. I know all of it was very real. And a lot of it actually helped me develop a spiritual path, because I was like, okay, this is real. There's however you want to understand it or describe it, there's very real forces that are working against me moving towards anything that's good and beautiful and loving and free and whole, and if I'm not aware of how this kind of invisible reality is impacting me, then I can't really move forward effectively. So I know it's real because I grew up around it. For me, it's just how the stories I tell myself about that stuff is what's important to me, and how I relate to it is really important to me. And one of the things that I have realized through spending time in other spiritual communities, other than just charismatic Christianity, is that the same experiences show up in all of these different traditions. There's just different words and names and ideas and ways of interpreting experiences, and there's definitely like specific nuance to different spaces and how I've seen those show up, but demons are something that's been in Buddhist cosmology for a long time. There's actually more realms of hell in the cosmology of Buddhism, and they talk more about hell from a really dynamic, insane, cosmological way than even Christianity does. So there's a lot of religious overlap in these understandings, and for me the important thing is developing really helpful ways of responding to these experiences. And for me right now at 33, a lot of the way I understand what I would, and I'm going to get really basic about it because I could spend another 40 minutes talking about this, but the way that I would really simplify all of the demonic would be a lack of agency. So I believe that every human has really universal deep desires inside of them that are just hardwired in. And because of a lot of different forces, not just spiritual kind of other realmly forces, we have a challenge to fulfill those desires. And in the space between these desires we have and our capacity and ability to like make those happen, that's where for me the demonic and angelic and any kind of other realmly beings go into play. And I'm able to relate to it in a way that's very in my life, not in another. I'm pulling myself out of my body into another realm, and it's not integrated into my normal life. So I think there's a whole lot of things that come into play in that, creating that agency to actually like move into living the life we want to live, and being who we want to be, and experiencing the things that we desire to experience. And but that's the space where I feel like that battle happens, that spiritual battle. And it's ultimately in between our ears. It's all in our mental space, which is why I think the most real and authentic spiritual work I've done so far has been my movement into Buddhism, because it's been all about learning to navigate the mind and move through these processes of this is where I want to be, this is where I am, this is what's holding me back, and understanding that. And so that's kind of how I've very simply understood that, and that's been really helpful for me to not create a lot of insane stories around it. There's a lot of really beautiful cosmology in Buddhism that I've really enjoyed that's more connected to the belief in reincarnation, that I won't dive into right now because that's a fun little rabbit hole. But that's helped give me a much more spacious, equanimous understanding of the demonic, and not react to the demonic, but just be like, this is the role it plays in my life in a really helpful, constructive way. And if I try to fight it and battle it, then I'm just kind of getting pulled. I lose. I'm getting pulled into it. So to allow it to not impact my inner world has been really important. Whether I'm dealing with what seems to be a ghost, or whether I'm literally dealing with a really powerful demon, or I'm experiencing, demonic presences in other people. I never want to demonize someone, over spiritualize an experience where I may be just projecting, my own stuff onto it and just getting wrapped up in a world that's just not real, and come back to the real purpose of why I'm processing these things, which is usually like growing in love and being a really happy, whole person with a general sense of well-being and creating beautiful things with my life. And so yeah, that's kind of my understanding of the demonic. So how that overlaps with schizophrenia is, I think that personalities are not demons. They're just personalities, and but our personalities can be heavily oppressed and sometimes possessed, and so yeah, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding with people that naturally can shift in and out of really distinct personalities and make a lot of people really uncomfortable, because there's some similarities maybe in how that shows up in a human to maybe what it looks like for someone to be possessed by a demon, or oppressed, experiencing those things. So yeah, there was this phrase that popped up from I believe it's one of the Apostle Paul's letters to one of the early churches, I think. And he says, love covers a multitude of sins. And that popped up in my head this morning. And so I'll kind of leave with that. And my interpretation of that is that there's a lot of areas where we may be really struggling to get things right in the ways that we want to. And the process of just staying focused on love. What does love look like? Does it feel like? What is the experience of it? How can I bring more love into my life, my relationships? How can I experience more love, receive more love? It just kind of covers everything. We don't have to get into the nitty-gritty details of the demonic or trying to figure out how to become better people, but learning to stay and remain in love and grow in love and become love and become aware of this really beautiful, deep, powerful reality of love covers all of those things. And all those things will kind of work themselves out if we just stay focused on that. So for that reason, I don't really think about the demonic a whole lot. But yeah, I'll land the plane there. I've been talking for a while, and it looks like there's 6 people listening. Larissa just commented, and then I heard her laugh in the other room. And she said, I experience love when I drink Coca-Cola. Yeah, say more about that, Larissa. What's that experience like? And if anyone else has any thoughts, inputs, opinions, please leave them in the comment section or shoot me a text. And if not, we will end it there. Yeah, she's funny. I think that's Sakara. Sakara thought Larissa was funny. I think one of my favorite things about Larissa is that Larissa thinks Larissa's funny. It's awesome. And she is very, very funny. It's going to be fun to look back. Oh, you're welcome, baby. It's going to be fun to look back and watch this pea slowly grow. Because it's going to change a good bit throughout the process of these videos. Which will be fun to watch. Alright, well, if no one has any thoughts or feelings or commentary, then we will drop anchor here. You landing the plane yet? I am. Unless you have something you want to say, Larissa. In which case you can just walk into the room and say it. Come hang out with me. Not as fun as commenting on the live chat, I guess. I think this is going to be the longest one yet. What's going to be really funny, because the mic's still in the laptop, is if you can hear Larissa laughing in the background on the recording. Because there's a delay. There's probably like a 4 or 5 second delay. I wonder if you really listen, if you can hear it. All right, well, tomorrow morning I'll be tuning into Portland Friends of the Dhamma's Sunday Sila on Zoom at 10 a.m. So I'll probably go live after that. But I'll set up a reminder for that. The live thing and send out some text messages. But hope y'all have a beautiful Saturday, and experience a lot of love. And if you want to talk to me about anything related to any of this in person, FaceTime me, call me. I know this can be a really charged, sensitive topic for a lot of people, especially the demonic and mental illness and all that. So I wanted to be really careful with how I talked about it, but also not overly cautious. So if there's anything people want to talk about further, let me know. But hope y'all have a wonderful day. I love you a lot. And I'll be back tomorrow. Bye.